What do carbon credits, biological diversity units, and a social enterprise cafe in Kyneton have in common? This is Remarkable Regional Business. I'm Caleb Maxwell, and the answer to that question is Paul Dettmann. Paul is the founder and director of Cassinia Environmental and a bunch of other different really cool businesses. And in this episode, we dig into his business journey, some of his learnings, his lessons, his philosophy in business, and what these amazing businesses actually look like. I'm sure you're going to learn something. I hope you're inspired. Let's get into it. Paul, thank you so much for coming on this podcast, being in the studio with me here. You're very, very welcome.
Thank you. I've never done a filmed podcast before. So
first video podcast.
Exactly.
Come on.
Yeah.
All right. I'm super keen. You have just like a million things that I could ask about. You're a founder and a director of a couple of different companies. Do you want to just give me the list?
Well, that's a good question. I should have written it down. So the main thing we do is environmental restoration projects and protection. So Cassinia Environmental's that's our main gig, and that company started about 20 years ago, and now I'm no longer the CEO of that. Nathan Smith's running that, so that's sort of doing its thing and doing pretty good.
Nice.
I'm really happy with that. But on the journey, over the last 20 years, we started a few non-profits and started a few other companies and got a few on the simmering, hopefully going to turn into something. So it's a reasonable list. And
right.
After a busy day, people say, "How do you do what you do?" And I think, I don't know if that's the question. I think the question is, why do you do what you do? Well, I don't mean that. I just mean this is stupid, not in the
you've got
motivational sense.
You've got to have something that drives you, right?
Well, you do.
That's what you're hinting at.
I'm not. I'm just saying, why on earth do I do all this stuff?
Do you know why you do?
Why don't I have a day off? But because sometimes it gets really busy. Yesterday was a crazy day. But anyway, we can go through a bit of the list. So
let's go Cassinia Environmental. That's the biggest one.
That's the biggest, in terms of staff and capacity and footprint. Yeah, absolutely.
And what are some of the other?
Well, we sort of spun out this thing out of Cassinia Environmental called Cassinia Community. So this is like thinking about social. So Cassinia Environmental is basically environmental markets. Like, how do we do environmental good? How do we find lots of points of connection? Because sort of traditionally it's been philanthropy or government, but I guess environmental markets aren't just thinking about commodifying the environment, but it's more thinking about where's all the places that we could capture value and direct that toward environmental gain. So Cassinia is the main thing. But on the back of that, we've learned a few things and we've got a lot of networks, and we could do some non-environmental stuff that, potentially sort of, sometimes I use the idea of building a quilt. Like a quilt's a beautiful piece of useful thing, but it's made up of all these scraps of other things, Potentially it's not one big piece of material. And I feel like in order for us to build the quilt of Cassinia or whatever, it's always lots of threads that come together. So what does that look like for some sort of non-environmental stuff? And there's a few interesting projects that could sort of break out and become quite interesting.
Wow.
One of them, I'll just jump into one now,
please.
but one of them, and maybe we haven't even talked about this. I don't think we
this
have
is new
actually.
information to me. Right. I'm excited.
Well, it's like, what's the number one thing that people would aspire to for their lives in the world? And I think the number one thing, if you did a survey of everyone in the world, would be that their children would go to university.
Yeah.
I having worked in the global south for a while, it's like that's such a common aspiration.
Yeah, right.
And I heard a stat yesterday, that by 2030, 42% of people under the age of 20, I think it was, will live in Africa. So isn't that amazing? It's nearly half the world's children and young adults will be African by 2030. Now,
that's amazing.
Maybe we need to fact check that, but I think that was it. So,
that's huge.
And Africa's potential access to university, by comparison, is very small. So if university is the thing, did you go to university?
I did, yes.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I went to university. I mean, university's got problems too, but
Yeah.
you do learn a lot of stuff, and
Yeah.
it's a great way of launching, your thinking, your career, and your networks, all that stuff.
Yeah.
People who went to university, on average, are glad they did.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's just go with that.
Yeah.
But if Africa's not got this access, and the developing world, the global South hasn't got this access, that's a problem. Especially 42% of people who need it are going to be in Africa by 2030. So we're thinking about what are the barriers? Well, the barriers are pretty obvious. The government hasn't got what we've got in terms of HECS and these. Could we develop something using all the approaches and scrappiness we've learned and from environmental space? Could we find a way to create a product, I suppose, a way for potential university students to tap into education in the global South?
Wow.
And we've spent 1.5 years on this, and we think there's a model.
Okay.
And it's pretty exciting.
That is really exciting.
Yeah.
So
that's like one of the social. There's 8. That's probably the one that's the most exciting, most developed. But there's 8 projects like that in what we call Cassinia Community.
Wow.
And then Cassinia Environmental. Yeah, it's leading its work in reforestation and sort of environmental restoration and environmental protection throughout South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales. But interested in going other places too.
Wow.
And then we've got this other project called Wilderlands, wilderlands.earth, which is...
Yeah, tell us about Wilderlands.
Wilderlands is, so Wilderlands is environmental as well, but it's looking at the idea of, at the moment, we're sort of familiar with carbon. Carbon market's been around, 20 years. But when the Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed back in the 90s, we also signed, and actually it got ratified earlier, a Framework Convention on Biological Diversity, which is basically nature. Biodiversity is, natural systems for native species. That's how we would define biodiversity.
Yeah. So let me test that knowledge that what that sounds like to me. So when I'm thinking about biodiversity, I'm thinking what is biodiverse and what isn't. What isn't could be when a massive land is stripped of all of its vegetation, for example, and used to grow things for massive large-scale farms and some, literally take everything off.
Yeah.
That would be non-biodiverse. It'd be like, what's the opposite of diverse?
Monoculture?
Yeah,
Like
monoculture.
yeah.
Whereas your company and your focus in the environmental space is building up biodiversity, not replacing farms, for example, but adding back in natural vegetation or what would be there, and that actually helps the soil, everything, the ecosystem of that environment. It's better for that land and better for everything, right?
Yep, that's right.
Yes.
Yep.
Great.
Yep.
Nailed it.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Well, we'd also see that like landscapes, like there's lots of aspirations that are in landscapes. So we've got food production.
Yep.
And we've got fibre production, and we've got livelihoods, and we've got communities. But we've also got a whole lot of sort of non-human aspirations, like, native species want to live and flourish. And I guess our position is that maybe 2/3 of a landscape should be used for the aspirations of people, and 1/3 of them should be used for the aspirations of nature. And
Cool.
so the example you gave of the monoculture, that wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, we're never going to do that. It's like, but how in this landscape, how do we realise the aspirations of the farmers, but also realise the aspirations of these other species? And
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite the responsibility and the balance, right? To how what is the balance? So I love that you've had that like 1/3, 2/3 kind of basic thought. So we paused there on Wilderlands. Tell me a little bit about Wilderlands.
Yeah, that's right. We did. so Wilderlands is like, well, carbon's become a thing. We've signed this Convention on Climate Change. We've also signed this Biological Diversity Convention. What's that going to look like when people really start to go, okay, how do I know how to buy a carbon credit and I know how to think about that. what's it like for individuals and businesses to think about what does it mean for me to engage with this other convention? And yeah, so Woodlands is one of the first movers in terms of developing a biodiversity credit, a bit like a carbon credit, and we've got a white paper, so you can see woodlands.earth, and you can download the white paper off the website. It's sort of like our theory of change of how this should be rolled out and made real.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. High level.
Yep.
Let's go. What is, for those who don't know, what is a carbon credit? And then what's this idea, high level version of what's a biodiversity credit?
Okay. Yeah. So a carbon credit, there's a little bit of controversy about carbon credits. Some people think they shouldn't be a thing. So I suppose put that up front. I think they've definitely got a place in the transition, but I think that the co-benefits of carbon credits are often far more valuable than the carbon credit piece themselves, and they enable ways of thinking about change, and they value other parts of the value chain. I suppose we did some work in Africa where carbon credits really add to livelihoods. But what is a carbon credit?
Yep.
I mean, essentially a carbon credit means an activity that either prevents or absorbs a ton of carbon. So it could be growing trees, and so generally a carbon credit will be the equivalent of 1 ton of carbon dioxide that'll be absorbed in those trees, or it could be in soil, or it could be avoiding the emissions of those, comparing it to the baseline, what would have happened if we hadn't have done anything, and if we go and do something like build a renewable energy, piece of infrastructure compared to a coal-fired piece of infrastructure, then we can get, the number of units that didn't get emitted from that. So that's carbon credits.
And so this system was started as an incentive for...
Yeah, an incentive companies are looking for ways to overall reduce their impact on the environment, and they can reduce their emissions, they can reduce
It's a way to measure,
use.
I suppose.
Yeah, it's a benchmark against which we measure. And we measure the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in parts per million, and there's thresholds that are slowly being breached, and we don't want to get above 450 parts per million or whatever. So biodiversity credits are a little bit similar in that our threshold is we'd like to see, and the global biodiversity framework says we'd like to see 30% of the world managed for nature. So our theory of change has always been a third, 2/3, but the global biodiversity framework is almost the same. It's
pretty
30%.
Close.
Yeah. So that's really measured in square meters, in area, in hectares.
Okay.
So our approach to developing biodiversity credits is in square meters of native vegetation that was not managed for its nature features, but is converted to management purely for conservation.
Right.
Back to the square meter.
And so when we're talking about both carbon credits and biodiversity credits, are they traded or transacted mainly through corporations or individuals?
Yeah, so carbon, there's a compliance market and there's a voluntary market.
Yep.
Yeah. So mostly corporations, I'd say, on both, but voluntary is perhaps more individuals, or there's more certainly individuals in the voluntary space, but in the compliance space there's a lot of intercompany stuff. Permits.
So in terms of compliance, you're talking about there's certain thresholds or certain measurements, benchmarks that companies are required to meet if they're, say, a high emitting industry. How does that kind of work?
Yeah, that's right. And look, this is driven out of Europe, and most of the industry is happening in Europe, and Europe is via regulation reducing the emissions that are coming out of different companies, different sectors. So that's where the bulk of the, it's about 850 billion euros was transacted in the carbon market last year. But most of that will be intergovernmental, between governments and corporations, and and most of it's happening in Europe. I think our space is the nature-based space, and I don't have the numbers right at hand, but we'd be like 1% of the global carbon market. But when it comes to biodiversity, the nature-based space is the biodiversity market, really. So we're really interested in ensuring that all species have the ability to thrive. And so carbon's a bit of the co-benefits of carbon can be biodiversity, but the biodiversity market is, that's the main game. So we're excited about the development of that over the next 7 years, because the 30% that's aspired to in the global biodiversity framework is by 2030. So we've sort of got this lead up to 2030.
Right. Wow. Righto. So we've touched on Cassinia Environmental, Cassinia Community, Wilderlands. You're based out of Kyneton, right?
Yep.
And there's one of my favourite cafes is actually in Kyneton. Can you tell me a little bit about the Social Foundry?
So, I mentioned that there's a couple of sort of non-profits that have happened along the way, and me and a mate of mine from Kyneton, Simon Burnett, had this idea around a social enterprise. It's like it was originally conceived as a way to bring sort of workplace mentoring back into perhaps, people who had limited opportunities to break into the workforce, and what would workplace mentoring look like in order to develop skills, both job skills and life skills, and could we do that through a social enterprise model? And so Social Foundry, 2016 we kicked that off. And
did you answer that question? Could you do it?
Well, it's hard. It's a lot harder than we thought. And hospitality's, we thought, this is going to be like, everyone, there's so many cafes, they must be easy to sort of turn a profit and be able to run this thing out of a hospitality sort of enterprise model. And that's a lot harder than we thought. I'm sure if anyone listens to this, anyone who's been in hospitality will be going, yep. Yeah,
it's a lot harder than people
think.
That.
Oh, look, there's just so many complexities to it.
Well, the standards, I often think about hospitality, the standards of excellence are so high, and people's standards and expectations on their experiences are ridiculously high, but the money exchanged in that transaction is very, very small. So, man, hats off to anyone in hospitality, I say, because they do phenomenal work on really not very much at all. But there's this cultural value, I think, that we have, especially as Australians, Victorians, for hospitality.
To be good.
To be great. To be excellent. So there's a little bit of a mismatch of,
what we pay for.
Yeah, what the market's able to charge and what we expect. But I can say from my journey of seeing the Social Foundry over its existence, that it is one of those excellent places. It's it presents a great culture, a great vibe. You can tell that the people working there, whether they're on a mentorship situation or not, they have this. It seems like to me, and you can tell me if I'm right or not. It seems like they feel like they're a part of something bigger than just a cafe. Would you say that's part of it?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I do. Look, it's hard, but it's incredibly rewarding. But it's one that, I feel like hospitality people, like some of the work that I do in the rest of my life, meet some amazing people, have some amazing experience, go to some amazing places, and I'm like, I don't reckon I work anywhere near as hard as the people who are running the cafe. It's just so relentless, and they've got to be on their game all the time. But I think they are in our Social Foundry anyway. I think they're really bought into the fact that this is about more than just a job, which is beautiful. But it's not for the faint-hearted either, because there's just a million things. There's just always a million things. The grease trap. There's like, who would have thought that you got to spend this much money every quarter on this thing? Oh, we've got to make, if we're making 10%, that means we need to turn over this amount to make, and then there's a million of those type of things. So it's tricky, actually. Yeah. But it's great. It's very rewarding.
Kudos to all of you hospitality people out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
We respect you. All right, I want to just do a little bit of a deep dive into Cassinia. Cassinia Environmental, What we've talked a little bit about the carbon trading, the carbon credit kind of access. What does that look like practically for you?
Yeah.
What's the scale of your team? What are the actual on the ground actions that you're taking every day?
Can I, rather than answer that question directly like
course.
that, can I
Of
go
course.
back to how it's like how we
Yeah.
started and,
Yes.
and like go back?
Please.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Because I feel like that gives the context and then we can
Great.
sort of unpack where we're at now.
Great.
And it's always, I love hearing people's stories.
Yeah.
So I grew up, just like you said, I grew up in Kyneton actually, sixth generation on the family farm just north of Kyneton. Yeah. And my dad's still on the farm and my son's on the farm. So I feel really connected geographically into that sort of north of Kyneton space. Studied ag at Dookie, at Ag College, and followed it up by doing a master's looking at how farmers value nature. And I got offered this master's by my supervisor in my bachelor degree, and I was like, yeah, it was such a great thing to be able to step in and do this piece of research for 3 or 4 years and really understand, the way farmers think about nature. Came out of that going, I really, this is the space I'm going to spend, if not the rest of my career in, a good chunk. So started Cassinia sort of 2000, it was about 2000, but was working as an agronomist with elders at the time and 3 or 4 years of that while I was trying to propagate this business on the side, make it happen. Got a couple of sales. Bendigo Bank was the first ever customer we had.
Really?
So shout out to Bendigo Bank.
Nice.
Just the way they took a punt on us to offset their fleet back in 2003 or 4 or something.
Wow.
Yeah, it was amazing. And I think we charged them like $3,000, and we actually contracted the work to get done. And that was $2,700. So the profit for that year was $300. But
Yes.
we had it was a great little project, and it's still there. So yeah, that was the beginning, and then we picked up some work with Greenfleet. We were contracting a lot of their plantings in sort of 2004, 5, 6. Had a couple of staff. We started buying land in 2008. So we the model switched from being able to do stuff just contractually, like you've got a bit of land, we'll plant some trees, we'll write a contract, and we'll agree to the contract. To 2008, we realised we had to get stuff on title. So if it's sold, people couldn't chop the trees down. So, and no one really wants to stick stuff on the title of their land, like that's forever. Yeah, so we suddenly, our whole supply dropped out, and we're like, what do we do? Do we shut the business down, or is there another model? And then we thought maybe we could buy land and think about other ways of financing this as well. So we mortgaged the house, bought a piece of land, just sort of between Inglewood and Wedderburn near Mount Corong, and did our first sort of big project that we owned ourselves.
Wow.
And amazingly, met some great people who I still work with in that journey of that first project, and found this threatened. Well, it was actually an extinct orchid. Bush Heritage, who had a property quite close by, had just found it on their reserve, and we got some surveys done on our property, and it was there as well. So it was so cool to have stepped into a project like that, fairly ambitiously, and felt a little bit nervous to mortgage a house and buy something like that. But then once we'd found something as special as that, it was like, this is great.
Yeah, wow.
So did a whole lot of restoration work, protected the good bits where the orchids were. It was about 1,000 hectares, that project.
Yeah, wow.
And then things have we switched over to that. We buy the project, and then we think about, how do we make this work from 3 or 4 or 5 different income streams?
Wow.
And so then the team's just grown, sort of incrementally, 2, 3, 4, 5. In 2019, I think, Nathan, who's now the CEO, joined, and that was a real shift of, okay, we're bringing somebody in who's a real systems, got a real systems approach, a systems thinker, somebody who can really help us scale. And so since 2019, we've had a fair bit of growth.
Right.
We're now Cassinia Environmental is now a team of about 40. So
Wow.
yeah, so really from 5 or 6 or something when Nathan joined, it's been a rapid scale up.
That's
But
huge.
yeah, it is. The biggest thing
Yeah.
that's sort of on it, that's been in our wheelhouse for a year now, and it's going to be the biggest part of our next 5 years, is a Victorian government program called Bushbank.
Tell me about
Yeah,
Bushbank.
Bushbank. Yeah, Bushbank is a state government initiative that it's got a few different facets to it. There's private land, there's working with traditional owners, and then there's a public land piece as well. So they put out to tender the private land piece, which is about $30 million worth of investment in the landscape to realise 20,000 hectares of new biodiverse vegetation protected in Victoria with Trust for Nature. So we put a bid in for that. Fortunately, we're able to win that, and so we've got a really good partner in the state, and we've got our other partners in the carbon space.
Yep.
Greenfleet still work with us. We've got a great partner out of the Netherlands called Landlife, and they've been a wonderful.
So you're working on Bushbank. You're working with you've got the private. You put in the bid for the private land kind of initiative from the state government. Did you? What happened from there? Was there any other part of the project?
Yeah, so there is. So the state's putting in, their contribution, which works out. I mean, there's a whole lot of fees that'll have to go back to Trust for Nature to get all these covenants, all these legal things on title, and so we've got about $1,000 a hectare to play with to get this thing sorted across the state. $900 probably, but we recognise that some places that cost a lot more, and some places that cost a lot more. To do.
Well, let's just dig into that slightly, because that's really interesting. For those who have no idea about land management, restoration work, what do you just like look at a piece of dirt and go, let's put a couple of gum trees there? Like what does the actual work look like?
Yeah, that's a really it's good to go back to that very early sort of what we're thinking about. So like we talked about, a third of land managed for nature. It's not just any third either. Like it's got to be like, we'd like to see, one of the goals we'd like to see is all our national parks reconnected. So, and there's a reason for that. Like, we think about species extinction, and we've lost, the thylacine. We think, that species is gone. What a tragedy! And that's absolutely true. That's a tragedy. But what we don't see is the small reserves that were once populated with, many different species. If they're small, the genetic diversity of the species within that reserve slowly declines over time. So you might have some birds that don't move far, that are sort of, because everything else around it's been cleared, they're sort of trapped in this, and then they're inbreeding, and then they drop out. Their genetic diversity is not sufficient to maintain the population, so they drop out. And no one had noticed, like this might be like 50 acres at the back of someone's farm that used to have a bunch of species that now aren't there. And that's sort of happening all over the landscape. Now, national parks and big areas are often refuges, and there's enough genetic diversity in those that you've got viable populations. But the specific genetic diversity that was in these isolated private areas is lost. Wow. And then over time, the thing about national parks is generally they were the areas of land that the farmers didn't want to clear because they came later.
Yep.
It's like nobody cleared the Grampians because what are you going to do with it? So it got left, and like we end up with a whole lot of species that that are suitably happy in those sort of rocky, steep, less soil environments. And then all the good soils and all the species that would have once lived in there are like isolated in their little tiny patches of stuff left on the back of farms and stuff. Wow. So it's like, because we're in a different ecosystem, we're in a plains, deeper soil, whatever. So reconnecting those isolated patches with the larger, national parks, and sort of seeing that inter-landscape connectivity really work functionally is a it's a long-term goal.
Yeah.
So when we go right back to Bushbank, like what do we do? Do we just pick a patch of dirt and plant a few trees? We usually start by going, well, where do we want to, which are the bits of the landscape that we can prioritise and we want to work in? And there's lots of other organisations doing the same thing. It's not like we're making this up for ourselves, but there's all sorts of partners that are doing all sorts of wonderful work. But we'd always be thinking about if an opportunity comes up, like how does this fit? What's the landscape context? And probably a third of opportunities might have some utility in terms of drawing sort of that landscape context piece back together. And maybe 1 in 10 that we look at, we actually go, yep, we really should pursue this opportunity.
Right.
So
that connecting all the national parks, how long do you think, and how complex?
It's a 100-year project, I reckon. Yeah. At our current sort of bumbling along rate, that we do as Victoria at the moment. But
yes.
But yeah, I mean, it took 150 years to clear it, so it's going to take a while to put it back together.
True.
Yeah.
And so Bushbank in itself, there's a private component. Like, who engages with this program? Like, you're won the bid for delivering it, but who else engages with it? In terms of customers, client, public.
So pretty much landholders who own more than 20 hectares that are willing to put that into a conservation covenant. So that's who we're aiming for.
Right.
Now there's two parts to Bushbank too. Like Cassinia's model over the last 20 years has been we buy land at scale and do these sort of large, nature restoration projects. So we'll continue to do that, and that'll continue to feed into Bushbank. And about half of the target 20,000 hectare, we anticipate that we'll end up having our name on the title at some point in the thing. Now, we'd love to be working with First Nations and say some of that transition back to First Nations communities, and there'll be lots of different iterations about where it goes. But about half of it will be, private land that is not us. It's other people's land that we manage these restoration projects sort of in conjunction with these landholders. So reaching out to them. I think we've done an expression of interest campaign. I think we've had maybe a couple of hundred people express interest in this, and then we've shortlisted that back to, I'm not deep in the detail of this, but I think maybe 20 or so that we're actually actively pursuing for the possibility of planning within the next sort of 12 months.
All right.
Months, yeah.
So for anyone that may be listening thinking, oh, that kind of sounds like me, like how would they engage?
So one of our partners is another local business called Vegetation Link, and you could do a podcast on them one day. They're really very cool. They won Business Excellence Award from Alexander a year or two ago.
Right.
They're a great little organisation. And we work with them a lot. And they've actually been sort of brought into Bushbank as our sort of first point of contact. So if people are interested, they've got a bunch of people that can take the phone calls and pull up the maps and then model what this might look like.
Cool.
And sort of do the first cut on, are the landowners willing to do what's needed to be done to make it a Bushbank project? Yep. Is it the scale?
Yeah, is it going to work?
Yeah, is it going to work? So then from that'll come back to to our team.
Cool.
Yeah. And then we'd go and map the site, decide on a project plan, and if the landholders are ready to go ahead, then we'd, ordering seed, because we do a lot of direct seeding. Most of our work is direct seeded rather than tube stock, but there's tube stock as well. Yep. Order tube stock, order seed for the direct seeding, and then control all the threats, rabbits, woody weeds, whatever else might be an issue, do the fencing, and then sow or plant the project, and then follow up with whatever else is needed to have a management plan for that, and then get the covenant on. So we work with Trust for Nature and put these conservation covenants on land that mean that it's managed for nature forever. So.
Wow. So just briefly, let's clarify covenants on land for that, if that's an unfamiliar term. So what is a covenant on a piece of land?
Yeah, so a covenant is like a restriction on use, really. So we have covenants in, building, like some estates will have a covenant that you can't build certain types of houses, or they have to be certain colours or materials or whatever. But covenants, when it comes to conservation covenants, they're like effectively what we talked about before. They're like making sure legally that this land is only managed for nature in the future. So Trust for Nature is a statutory body set up by the state government back in the 70s. It's been around about 50 years, and their job is to develop this legal instrument that can make sure that private land that's got good conservation values, protected for conservation forever. So Cassinia has been working with Trust for Nature since 2008, since we did our first purchase, and we're now Trust for Nature's largest covenanting partner. So we work with them, talking to them every week, and sort of increasing what we would call the natural estate. We're increasing the land managed for nature on private land through these covenants.
Very cool. All right, I think we're all caught up on what Cassinia Environmental is and how it works. But in terms of what makes it a great company, what are some success stories? We've talked about winning talked a little bit about winning the Bushbank bid, but give me some other highlights across the Cassinia Environmental journey.
Yeah, there's lots of places you can go with this, isn't there?
Yeah.
And you as a small business owner would, it'd be interesting to hear you answer the same question. I mean, I think one of the I'll give you three highlights. One of the highlights is the partnerships you build with companies that are on the journey with you. And I remember my dad saying when I started my first business when I was like 21, which I sold, when I finished my master's. But I remember him saying right back at the start of that journey, he's like, it's easy to find a new, partner, a new supplier of this or that. But you can only do it so many times, and then you've got to go back to, where you started. If you fall out if there's four people who make this product and you want to buy this product for your, whatever you're building or making, and you tick one and then you tick another one off and you tick another one off, then you've only got one left, it's like, he's like, you want to, as far as you can, build a long-term relationship with your partner and grow together. Yeah. And I remember him saying this when I was like 20. And so.
Yeah, right.
I think advice. It's so true though. Because, if you find a good partner, just, go on the journey together. And if they let you down and you need to move on, well, you need to move on. But if you can find a way and make sure there's enough in it for them to really enjoy the partnership as well. And do these long-term journeys together. And I feel like that's, from a business perspective, I feel like that's a really good piece of advice. Aspire to have really long-term journeys with, the people you join. So Vegetation Link's one example. We've been with them since they started. We might have even been their first customer, actually.
Wow.
And it's just a long and flourishing. It's just a nurturing, a nourishing journey together. Right?
Yeah,
and
that's
their
really
success
wise.
is our success.
Yeah. I love that advice. Your dad did you great service with that one.
Thanks, Dad. Yeah.
So that's one of the highlights.
Yeah, that's one. Yeah, and I just say that we've got Vegetation Link is one example. We've got another one, a company out of Amsterdam called Land Life. And I was on the call with them yesterday. And that's, we've worked with them since 2019. And that's a beautiful journey. It's just a beautiful relationship to build. And, I love the fact that we're saying, well, is there enough in it for you? Is this good? Is this a good deal for you? And they'll say the same to us. We don't want you to shortchange yourself. We want to make sure you're really enjoying and getting what you want out of this. Great. And if we're mutually looking out for that in each other, then it just builds this just enjoyable work. Yeah. I think that's one thing. I think the second thing is your staff. And it's sort of the same thing, but if you can really enjoy the relationships you have with your team, and find people you can go on a long journey with, that's a beautiful thing too.
Does that come down to, because, people are people and they make messes. Oh, yeah. Does that come down to your ability to deal with those messes effectively?
I came up with an analogy yesterday. It's funny we have this. And I'm like, I reckon that's the perfect analogy for staff. I don't know if you've ever done this, but I've built a few stone walls.
Yeah,
And
I have.
Yeah, have you built some stone walls?
Well, some brick ones and
Yeah,
some
well,
very...
some brick ones and
Yeah.
stone ones. So,
Yeah.
like, there's two different types. You
Yes.
can build a brick wall or a stone wall.
Yep.
Now, if you build a really good stone wall,
Yeah.
it, I reckon, looks better than a good brick wall.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Big time.
And why is that? It's because every stone is different. Now, you've got, with a brick wall, you've got the ability to screw it up by just being a bad tradesman or whatever. But you pretty much, you know that every brick's going to be the same.
Yep.
But people aren't like bricks. No. People are like stones. Every stone is different and every person's different. And to create a really beautiful stone wall, you've actually used all these differences, but you've made it look, you know, if you do a really good job, you get a nice smooth edge and you've got the diversity, but the consistency and all that. And I think like working with staff is a little bit like building a stone wall.
Yes.
Like finding the right people that have the right fit and then, you know, making that the place they fit, the place that complements everything else. And it's not not like bricks though.
No,
you know, it's like
not.
If you could hire staff like bricks, it'd be so much easier. They're all the same, they're all consistent.
I think plenty of people try, and
I
that's
know.
kind of a downfall. I love that analogy. If I was to take it a little bit further, I would say I've heard from a stonemason before that in the building process, you use the next brick you pick up.
Yes,
and
exactly.
you can't pick one up and put it down again. Like you pick one up and it's going on that wall somewhere.
There is a place that it'll fit.
There is always a place that it'll fit, and it's about that matching the space with the stone.
Yeah.
I think that's a perfect analogy.
Yeah, good.
Did that just dawn on you the other day?
Yesterday I was walking, I was talking to this mate of mine, I'm like, I think building a team is like building a stone wall.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
So team.
And so not everyone that you would like to hire is going to fit your team, but once you have a team, like, you know, you find people's sweet spot and you try to really make them flourish and, you know, So I think, we've got a beautiful team, and maybe I'm not there when I'm not there.
Yeah.
So, you know, maybe everyone's like, Paul's like just in this dream world of, you know, thinking everything's fine.
It's romanticizing it a bit.
Totally naive to what's really going on. But that possibility aside, I feel like if I was left with only the friends in the world that I made at work, I'd probably have enough friends. Like,
wow.
I just love our team. I just think we've got some of the most amazing, beautiful people, and they work so well together. And so I think, from business advice, like build long partnerships, you know, think about your team, you know, build good relationships with your team, and you know, and this, it doesn't mean things aren't going to be hard. Doesn't mean you're not going to have to make hard decisions, and sometimes make the hard call to say, actually, I don't know where this stone fits in this wall. That occasionally happens, but generally, if you can make it work, there's a place
I love
for
that.
everyone.
There's so much we could talk about in terms of team building and team leading, but one thing I love about a healthy, functioning team is the requirement for a vision for them to unify around. Would you say that Cassinia has that? Is that one of the elements that?
I think so. Yeah.
What would you? How would you describe that vision? I mean, it's probably put really simply in a really short sentence somewhere, but
you know, we say like, and I think this is the Catchment Authority has a very similar vision statement, but people and nature flourishing, you know, creating opportunities for people and nature to flourish.
Yep.
Our goal would be 30% or a third of the landscape managed for nature. But so I think people, you know, coalesce around those two things. And then I think we try to create an environment that, you know, is, you know, I hope is welcoming and is nourishing, and I hope people feel that. But we do fall in around that vision.
That, you know, you expand that vision out, and there are layers upon layers of values that people can align themselves to. Like that, you've got a really strong, actual on the ground grassroots work in environmental restoration. That is a big driver for many people. And I know when we're talking about traditional owners, man, that is
even
deep,
more so,
deep. You know, their connection to country is within them, right? It's weaved through their thousands of years of culture and tradition, and that means so much. It's so personal. But even for people who aren't traditional owners, like myself, I take the responsibility and the power I have over land and space really seriously, and it's not something that to be ignored or tossed aside. That is my responsibility as a human, is to treat the management of the land that I have been given or have purchased with respect, and to leave it better, and to lift it and without, there's this I don't know what you think about this, but there's kind of a belief going around that humans are a bit of a scourge on the earth. The earth would be better off if humans never existed. I think that's kind of a bit of a misaligned kind of perspective, in that humans for a long time and for a period have done not good things. And they haven't treated their responsibility well. But that doesn't mean that if you remove humans that the whole earth is better, right?
No.
Because it is designed to be an ecosystem where one part benefits the other. And if we're playing our role correctly, then we will be a huge benefit on the environment. What would your thoughts be to that?
Well, I agree. We've got the potential to be that, absolutely. And it's interesting, like the pendulum sort of swung potentially from being, we should wipe out every tree and clear every forest and plant crops and make the world a better place, quote unquote, by having this incredibly sort of productive potential. And we sort of pursued that idea, well, probably for a couple hundred years. I was in the UK and saw the fens that had been drained in the 1850s, and it's like huge, diverse ecosystem that would have just been a mass extinction event when all that lowland area of the UK was drained. But they thought they were doing the right thing. They're turning it all to productive, agriculture, profitable. So, but I think then the pendulum swung the other way to what you're saying is like, our people are the problem, and people, we should get rid of all the people and then everything would be fine.
Yeah.
I heard a bit of, we got a book called, what's it called? Aboriginal Environmental Knowledge, I think the book's called, and it talks about this indigenous idea of land being lonely without people. Like people are needed on land for land to be, not lonely, to be fulfilled. And I feel like, if we think of ourselves as creatures in a creation, then we've got a role. Like there's a place for us as humans to be part of, and we've got jobs to do, and we're part, like you say, we're part of the ecosystem. We're meant to be in this thing, but we're not meant to be. We're meant to be stewarding this thing, like not exploiting this thing.
Yes,
it's a relationship of respect. And, mutual respect. That's so good. The when you say how the pendulum swung, and I think through a lack of knowledge or there's probably a lot to it, right? Why? We can go deep here.
I was just thinking, man, psychological. Anyway, through a lot of different factors, the proper stewardship of the land was tossed to the side, knowingly or unknowingly, through a lack of wisdom or understanding, and we saw what that did. We lost species. We still are. We're still reaping the impacts of those decisions. But the beauty of it is that it's not one wins or the other wins. It's not like you compromise productivity and human flourishing by promoting the flourishing of the land more. There's actually, from what I can see, a place where both of them flourish, and that's the place that is actually best for both. There's this biodiversity, for example. There's a massive movement in farming. It's probably gone been going for a long time, but it's becoming, I think it's ramping up a bit in understanding that it is so much healthier for your crops. You will get better yields. You will have better longevity over your land and your farm, and there's a million benefits. Like rising water tables, salination levels, and all that sort of stuff, with greater biodiversity in your soil and using more natural systems to like regenerative agriculture, for example. That's a big movement.
Yeah, it's a huge movement.
But that has a lot of benefits on the farmer, the people, the quality of the food, the amount of cost saving that there is potential for in not dumping and buying a heap of chemical or whatever to put on that land.
Yeah, that's a podcast, and it'd be great to have some. I mean, I feel like farmers are, we had the sort of period where we had Black Saturday and firefighters were the heroes, and then we had the pandemic and nurses were the heroes. I'm just waiting for the day something happens and farmers become the heroes, and we're like the rock stars of culture, of society, are these farmers. Because what farmers do, whether they're regenerative or conventional or whatever, is amazing.
It is amazing.
Amazing.
It's amazing.
It's
right?
amazing. They produce enough food that we can just walk down and go to the supermarket or go to the shops and just get whatever we want, whenever we want. And it's just it's amazing.
I think there's a real lack of understanding and value in our culture as we get further and further away from a predominantly agricultural community that the food just comes from the supermarket.
It's phenomenal. So, and then regenerative ag, that's it's got some real promise, I think, to think more naturally. But these things, the systems are set up now for a more, let's call it conventional approach. And we're learning more about soil biology, for example. And what the longevity of the current approach is, we don't really know. I guess I don't want to delve too far into saying, okay, let's throw all that out, because I think this is going to be a transition. What we are saying is that actually a third of the landscape should be managed not for agriculture but for nature. And then we need to do a better job on the 2/3 to make sure that is not not getting in the way. So we've got a project we're doing with Trust for Nature, where we've developed the Victoria anyways first farm covenant. So it's like the conservation covenant, but then what do we think about on the rest of the farm? What do we want to prohibit? What soil types are fragile that we should never perhaps plough those, and all the things that sort of sit outside the fence from the nature protection area. But by putting an encumbrance on, by putting a layer on, we can actually protect the agricultural land from, silly approaches and silly management approaches.
Great.
That would be detrimental to both agriculture and to, the conservation land adjoining it. So,
wow.
Yeah, so it's interesting. But there's a lot there. I mean, I used to work as an agronomist, so I've seen both sides of that conversation, and I think farmers are amazing. Yeah, and we are getting better. But we've got a better ethos, I think, in thinking about this stewardship idea rather than this sort of my right to exploit in whatever I want, whatever way I want.
Yeah, that'd be a rabbit hole that'd be never ending. A whole podcast series on its own.
Yeah, it'd be great. And I could put some people onto you.
Yeah, great.
You could interview and get some different perspectives.
As we kind of head into landing this plane of a podcast,
started,
I know. I want to touch on your journey in business, and I want to touch on, you've explored a couple of really cool things in what's made Cassinia amazing and what it is. But I wonder if you could walk us through, what are some learnings that you've had along the way, and what does that business journey look like, and what are some mistakes you've made, real big stuff ups that you're you learnt from?
I've got a friend whose name's Danny, and he was asked, it was a podcast he gave once, and he was asked what his 3 best pieces of business advice were.
Yeah.
And I've actually used his advice. I'm like, that is so good. I'm going to use that before. So I'll give you his three.
Okay.
I think, if I can remember him correctly,
Yeah.
he's like, his first one was persistence beats a good idea every time. And I was like, that is so true. If you demonstrate consistency and you don't give up on an idea. Now, a bad idea, you do need to know when to give up. But if it's not a bad idea, the benefit of persistence is so important.
Wow.
So important.
I love that.
Yeah, persistence beats a good idea. The second piece he gave was, and I think this is really true, is comparison is the death of happiness.
Wow.
Wow. Because there's always going to be somebody who is like, oh, if I was like that, or, somebody prettier or faster or richer or whatever, better at the thing you're trying to do than you are. And, I think finding the place to really enjoy your own race is good.
That speaks to the point you made earlier about building really strong relationships with businesses around you. We see it in the creative industries a lot, that with a lot of small operators doing the same thing, you can either go down a collaboration kind of viewpoint and culture, build that, or build the competition culture. And that one's no fun.
No.
This one, it leads to the flourishing, the rising tide lifts all ships kind of perspective. Yeah. And I think the comparison point of view, it being stealing your, a thief of happiness or whatever.
Yeah, comparison's the death of happiness.
That's really good.
It's so true. Yeah. And his third one is then do something that you enjoy that's fundamentally good for the world. Like, don't do something, just for the money. Do something that's got another layer to it that you also enjoy. And I feel like those three things are really valuable. In terms of the mistakes, that's a great question. I've made some mistakes, but I think a piece of advice I often give people, and I'm not ripping this off, Danny, but is like, hurry up and make some mistakes. Like,
good.
The first thing you got to do is get out there and screw some things up. Good. Like, everyone, and particularly people who work for government, are just so risk averse. It's like you never learn if you don't make mistakes. You got to like appropriately. Screw some things up, because that shows you that's where the best learnings are. And the fact that we call these things mistakes imply, that they're loaded with the fact that they shouldn't have happened. Yeah. Like, they're not really mistakes. They're just like, probing learning. So we've done, like, if you went back to, every iteration of Cassinia and every iteration of all these other things we're doing, it's like, it's just one thing after another that we realised wasn't the right thing. Yeah, like, cool. If you didn't have a map and you were trying to find your mate's house, you'd have to drive down a lot of streets. Now, is every street you drive down a mistake? It's just a way to learn where your mate doesn't live or whatever. So I feel like that's what it's like in all these things. Just keep trying. You won't get the right thing. You won't get the final thing the first time. You just got to just keep iterating. So making mistakes is critical. In terms of big mistakes that we've made, I probably don't even think about them as like regrets. It's like, we lost money on this deal, but we learned about, who not to deal with. Right. What a great opportunity to never deal with that group again or whatever.
I love that perspective though, because it's the optimistic view, but it's actually the one that gives you the learning, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Look, I'm not going to ignore it or beat myself up about this thing that happened, because failing is how we progress. Yeah, you've got to fail forward, right? Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. And a part of managing yourself well is like, if this fails, what's that going to do for me? Can I afford to fail in this? I need to be able to fail fast, fail often, but only fail once in that particular way and learn. And iterate. So I think that's a really valuable piece of business advice.
I love that.
Yeah.
So I want to come back. There's one challenge that maybe I want to dig into before we wrap this up. you mentioned Cassinia growing really, really rapidly in terms of staff and people. Was that really challenging to kind of keep everything aligned and moving? Was there any challenges that you learnt something from there, or you were like, man, feeling out of control at points?
Totally, yeah. Yeah, no, totally. Like it's all that was all the challenge because you can only grow so fast, and you can only have so many staff that don't know sort of the back story and the systems at one time. So I mean, this might be wrong, but maybe you can grow it like 50% a year, like in terms of new staff. Otherwise, there's too many people who don't really know what's going on. Now, if you hire good staff that have already got experience and they can slot right in, then that changes things. But yeah, I mean, Nathan's done more of this part than me. So
shout out to Nathan.
Yeah, shout out to Nathan, and shout out to my wife Rach, who's put up with this whole sort of chaos of this journey too for a long time.
Yeah.
And the rest of the family, and it's really been a shared journey with all with Nathan, and then Ash is running Woodlands, and that like the amount of times I turn up late for meetings or have to leave meetings early, where because there's lots of other things on, and these guys really carry this stuff, and then on the community stuff. I tried to hire somebody, and she kept. I tried to hire this one girl, and I tried to hire her over a year. I'm like, she's the perfect rock for the stone wall on the community stuff. And every time I call her, she's like, no. But I know who you should hire. Should hire this guy called Ross. And it took me about a year to actually ring Ross. I called her one day. It's like, you really, we've got this opportunity. You really should come and do this. And she said, have you called Ross yet? I was like, no.
No, I want you.
No, I said, no, I want you. She's like, I'm not even talking to you until you call Ross. So I called Ross, and then Ross has been with us for a year and a half, and cool. Ross is a genius. She was so right. I hope she doesn't ever have regret, because she nailed it. But these key people and Kiralee and the executive team of Cassinia, like it's just shout out to all of them. Yep. It is hard to grow, and it does get shaky. It's like building before the concrete's set. It can be wobbly, but these guys really carry it together. They carry it probably more than me, and they're amazing. So if you've got the right team,
I love that.
You can grow, but you don't want to grow too fast.
Yeah.
I think there'd be more businesses. I heard this quote: more businesses die from indigestion than starvation. And
too much.
It's true.
Yes.
I'm sure it's true. Yeah.
Yes.
We think, I can do all that, and you take it all on, and you realize you haven't got the systems, or you haven't got the capital, or whatever, to deliver on what you try to ingest. So be careful there.
That's great advice as well. I personally am looking forward to the day where I can have amazing people and rely on them and do what you seem to be doing, which is
be the rock,
be your thing, right?
Yeah, and the stone wall, I'm part of that too, and I've got a particular place, and there's a whole bunch of parts of that I'm just not suited to.
Yep.
But yeah, you got some great people too.
Yeah, and hopefully adding more.
Yeah.
So what's next? What does the future look like? What is on the horizons for
Well, I think
Paul
this
Dettmann?
community stuff is really interesting, and look, how long we got to unpack that. But there's another project that I haven't spoken about that I'll just close out with. In 2016, I went to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. And thanks to Tim Penny, who said, when you go to America, you've got to go to the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. Never thanked him for that, probably. And so anyway, we did. We were on a bit of a road trip. My wife's from the US, and we're on a bit of a road trip, and we were going close to Memphis, so we dropped in. And this is just like it's a journey through the civil rights movement from the 1800s and slavery, abolition, and through the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King's story, and the museum's actually set in the motel where he was shot. So very powerful.
Wow.
And just a ability to go for 3 hours, maybe just slowly through this long journey, this long struggle of, some amazing people. Anyway, I came away from that with a real feeling that this is amazing. I understand and I feel empathy and I feel connection with these people who've been through the struggle. But also thought, we've had the same struggle in Australia. Where can I go for that? Where can I have a deep, long, time to process and think what the struggle for, reconciliation we're in now, but before that recognition and before that, what the assimilation period was like and all the mistakes that were made there and, right back to first contact. Like there's a journey, there's a intersection between, Indigenous Australia and non-Indigenous Australia that has been going on for a couple of 100 years now or more. But we've got nowhere to explore and really understand that journey. Wow. So that's one of the other Cassinia Community projects is like, could we seed an idea like this and be part of working with others to create that thing?
That's a big project.
Yeah. Some filmmakers and stuff like that. That would be really... Yeah.
I know a couple.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
We should talk once we get into this. But yeah, it's a beautiful project.
Wow.
It is, I think, if we could create the same experience that the guys in Memphis created, that would be something good for the soul of Australia. So.
Wow. Oh, man, it gives me goosebumps just listening to you talk about it. I can't wait to follow the development of that journey. I think that's going to be huge. Well, thanks,
Cool.
Paul, for coming
Caleb.
on this.
Wonderful.
Wow, we've gone a whole lot of different places,
Yeah.
but it has been an absolute honour to hear some of your insights and some of your journey. I think it'll be a really, really riveting listen for those who choose to. So thank you.
No worries. Cheers.
Please hit the subscribe button and the like button, and I would love to hear what you think about it in the comments below.